The covenants of promise. Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 12. That at that time you were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope without God in the world. So the covenant made with Abraham, the state of blessedness developed among the nations of the earth when they are thus ruled by Jesus and his brethren, has been the subject of promise from the earliest dealings of God with mankind, and will only be the realization of the purpose proclaimed from the beginning. You should understand that the covenant made with Abraham is prophetic, bearing upon the future development of the divine purpose. The covenant guaranteed first the ultimate blessing of all nations through him and his seed. Now Yahweh said to Abraham, Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Genesis chapter 12 verses 1 to 3. And the scriptures, foreseeing that God would justify the heathen through faith, preached before the gospel unto Abraham, saying, In thee shall all nations be blessed. Galatians chapter 3 and verse 8. Second, the everlasting personal possession of the territory between the Euphrates and the Nile, known in the terms of modern geography as the land of Israel, and biblically as the Holy Land and the land of Canaan. And Yahweh said to Abraham after Lot separated from him, Lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward, for all the land which you see I give to you and your descendants forever, and I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants also could be numbered. Arise, walk in the land through its length and its width, for I give it to you. Genesis chapter 13 verses 14 to 17. Compare also Genesis chapter 12 and verse 7, and Genesis chapter 15 verses 8 to 18, and Genesis chapter 17 and verse 8. The promises made were renewed to Isaac and Jacob. Compare Genesis chapter 26 verses 2 to 4, and Genesis chapter 28 verses 3 to 4, and Genesis chapter 28 verses 13 and 14. These promises were not fulfilled in the life events of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, nor have they been fulfilled at any time since. And he, God, gave him, that is Abraham, no inheritance in it, no, not so much as to set his foot on, yet he promised that he would give it to him for a possession. Acts chapter 7 and verse 5. By faith Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed, and he went out, not knowing whither he went. By faith he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. Hebrews chapter 11 verses 8 and 9. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims in the land. Hebrews chapter 11 verses 13 to 35, and verse 39 and 40. Compare also Galatians chapter 3 verses 16 and 29, Romans chapter 15 and verse 8, Luke chapter 1 verses 68 to 73. These promises will be fulfilled in the establishment of the kingdom of David under Christ, that is, in the setting up of the kingdom of God on earth as the center of the universal empire. First, as to the blessings of the nations, see Isaiah chapter 2 and verse 4, Psalm 72 and verses 4 and 17, Jeremiah chapter 4 and verse 2, Isaiah chapter 11 verses 9 to 10, Isaiah chapter 32 verses 1 to 6, Jeremiah chapter 3 and verse 17, Zechariah chapter 9 and verse 10, Isaiah chapter 33 verses 5 to 6, and Psalm 76 and verse 4. Second, as to the inheritance of the land of promise, Leviticus chapter 26 and verse 42, Joel chapter 2 verses 18 and 21, Deuteronomy chapter 11 and verse 12, Ezekiel chapter 36 verses 34 to 36, Isaiah chapter 51 and verse 3, and chapter 62 and verse 4, chapter 60 and verse 15, Matthew chapter 8 and verse 11, Micah chapter 7 and verse 20, Numbers chapter 14 and verse 21. The promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are yet to be fulfilled in the setting up of the kingdom of God on earth, when all nations will rejoice in the righteous government of the seed of Abraham, who shall save the children of the needy and break in pieces the oppressor. Genesis chapter 13 verses 14 and 15, Galatians chapter 3 and verse 16, Luke chapter 13 verses 28 and 29, Psalm 72 verses 1 and 2, and verses 4 and 5 and 7 and 8, Revelation chapter 11 and verse 7, Revelation chapter 11 and verse 15. Christ, the coming destroyer of all human governments and the appointed ruler of mankind, who will break the kingdoms of men in pieces like a potter's vessel and raise the standard of universal dominion in Jerusalem, the holy city. Psalm 2 verses 6 and 9, Revelation chapter 2 verses 26 and 27, the book of Micah chapter 4 verses 2 and 3 and verse 8. The saints, the holy ones, Christ's people, the destined kings and priests of the world, destined to reign with Christ over all the earth, administrating his authority and dispensing blessings to all mankind. Revelation chapter 20 and verse 6, Revelation chapter 5 verses 9 and 10, Daniel chapter 7 and verse 27, Psalm 149 verses 6 and 9. The promise to David, I will set up thy seed after thee, which shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build an house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom for ever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son, and thy house and thy kingdom shall be established for ever before thee. Thy throne shall be established for ever. 2 Samuel chapter 7 verses 12 to 16. The covenant made with David, yet to be realized in the re-establishment of the kingdom of David in the Holy Land, in the personal hands of Christ. See 2 Samuel chapter 7 and verse 10, 12 to 13 and verse 16, Acts chapter 2 and verse 30, Luke chapter 1 verses 32 and 33, the book of Isaiah chapter 9 verses 6 and 7.